Hi Terry, I'm going to go through a proposed electrolyte hydration strategy that we've put a ton of thought into. In a nutshell, as best as Dave Wood can nutshell anything, we've um, we've been making electrolytes ever since Animix has been in existence. But just pre-COVID, Renell and I really focused on it to try to modernize our thoughts and what we would propose making to customers. We started with a trip to NC State to see Dr. Jeff Smith when he was still on staff there. He's recognized, you probably know, as a leader in this category, calf electrolytes. We shared research that we knew of and that he knew of, and he really got our head on straight on what modern electrolytes should be. We proceeded to conduct this study at Mapleview Agra in Ontario. It's published in JDS. Dr. Smith and Dr. Renaud and the crew at Mapleview are on that paper as well as ourselves. We documented high recovery rates with our electrolyte strategy. We've modeled it since then based on a complete literature review of all the data that we're aware of published out there. We've also done a battery of hotbox studies. Emily, our formulator and in QA/QC, did a remarkable job looking at various ingredients that are bugaboos that you put with sodium acetate that cause all the drastic bad problems. I like to say we've made every mistake possible, some of them that got out in the field throughout our tenure of making these specialized electrolytes that can correct blood acidemia and raise blood glucose, which are the two key things that you really need to look at, that and preventing sodium toxicity in an electrolyte strategy. And we've done that well out in the field for years and years and years. So you can use our products with confidence. You're going to see palatability work. I'm going to glide through these slides quickly, but we've hired kind of one of the last veal growers left standing where we can get access to stress calves, a big panel of them, and put products in front of those calves. And then the grower goes back and measures individual intake after an hour. And so we can get some stats and data behind what we're claiming on increasing voluntary fluid intake. But most importantly, these products very similar to what we're proposing here, have been researched. They've been sold out in the field as private label products with a lot of success. They've gone through batteries of hotbox studies to prove that they're shelf stable and they've been proven palatable. So without further ado, I'm going to glide through these slides, hopefully really quickly. I'll pause at each slide so you can stop and read the slide if you wish to. But I wanted in the intro to basically tell you what I'm going to tell you and also remind you of all the work we put into these electrolytes. I like this foundational study. It was conducted in Germany. This Dr. Treves, I've met some Europeans and say he's just a really thoughtful, quiet leader. He kicks out a lot of great research and really good vet students without a lot of drama and beating of his chest. But this study I particularly like because he sent his students out to farms that had critically ill diarrheic calves and or calves that came to his teaching facility. And they drew blood and could draw blood gas measures and also physically assess these calves. And his goal was to determine, why do these calves die? And his model was simple. After being assessed, 48 hours later, he would find out from the grower, did these calves live or did they die? And based on that key difference, did they live or did they die, he could go back to the blood gas measures and see what those measures looked like and see whether, what differences were there between the diarrheic calves that lived and the diarrheic calves that died. He found that in those 1,400 calves, the leading causes of death were acidemia, which isn't really surprising. Low blood glucose, that one kind of surprised me. And this one, the final one, really surprised me, was excessive sodium. So you've got to correct acidemia. You need to correct the low blood glucose level. And you have to do it with products that replace the tremendous losses of sodium, but that aren't fed for so long with treatment type products that you create sodium toxicity. So we'll start with correcting blood acidemia. And you can see, if you want to take time to look at that, blood pH levels is a really minor difference, but it still created a p-value of 0.005. So between the calves that lived and died, those that died were more acidotic. And we know that putting a blood buffer in there does help the calf. This is an old study, but a good one. The one on the left, it's a Canadian one published in a vet journal The calves were induced with coronavirus and they experienced severe diarrhea. And those that were treated with an electrolyte with sodium bicarbonate or with sodium acetate noted significantly improved recovery rates from diarrhea compared to those with no blood buffer. I think the one on the right is as well. This is some Purdue work, and this too is published in JDS. And these Holstein calves were induced with diarrhea and then fed a sodium acetate containing electrolyte or a ringer, a lactated ringer. And their plasma volume was measured, and they also looked at blood glucose levels and blood pH. I always looked at the ringer as being, by some veterinarians, some calf-focused veterinarians that I deeply admire, that really spoke about how a bag or two under the skin or in the vein could pull calves from the jaws of death of diarrhea. So I always viewed that as the gold standard. But if you look at what sodium acetate containing electrolyte did versus a lactated ringer, granted the plasma volume was resuscitated more quickly with the ringer, which is, it's kind of hard to beat just pumping it straight into the vein, but it wasn't too much further behind in time to replace that lost plasma. And more importantly, the blood acidemia was corrected and the blood glucose levels raised much higher if you fed the sodium acetate containing electrolyte versus IV fluids. So really one could argue, based on what diarrheic calves die from, which is acidemia and low blood glucose levels, the sodium acetate outperformed the ringer. And the reason we like sodium acetate is that the gastric barrier, which is the abomasum, we know that if you get pH above 5 or 5.5, depending on it, whether it's E. coli or salmonella, then those pathogens can proliferate. E. coli exposed to pH below 5 can't, and pH salmonella exposed to a pH below 5.5 can't survive. So the abomasum would be ideal. That's a natural barrier to keep it the same below that as much as you can. Now, Dr. Smith, when he was at NC State, looked at different brands of electrolyte and milk replacer and then measured abomasal pH over a 24-hour period. And he found that if you fed an electrolyte based off sodium acetate, that only about 10% of the day had a pH greater than 5.5. And that's because sodium acetate, although it will adjust pH a bit in the abomasum, it gets absorbed quickly, and then it's really processed in the liver, where that's where it releases its blood buffer. So most of its action is really done in the liver, versus sodium bicarbonate created an environment where 35 to 43%, almost 44, of the 24-hour period had a pH above 5.5. So bicarb, even though it corrects blood acidemia, it has this wart or this problem of creating a longer period of time that abomasum leaves the door open for salmonella or E. coli to enter the GI tract. Now, just feeding a calf, feeding it some milk replacer, I'm sure whole milk as well, it's going to leave about a fifth of the day open for a high pH. But the whole idea here with sodium acetate is to just not, I like to say, leave the door open for as long so that those pathogens have less of a time to get in. And now this is some really busy slides, but this is Mike Ballou's lab's work at Texas Tech. And basically what he looked at here was pulling abomasal fluid out of calves that were treated either with a sodium acetate containing electrolyte or a sodium bicarb based electrolyte, with or without milk replacer being fed. And I'm going to tell you the bottom line of this study. When he pulled it out, he saw that E. coli grew more quickly in the abomasal fluid from a calf fed a sodium bicarb based electrolyte versus one fed a sodium acetate containing electrolyte. So he really quantified in a published study this fact that we know, that it was Jeff Smith's hypothesis. So what's the bottom line between proper blood buffer for a treatment type electrolyte? Both are equally effective in correcting blood acidemia. Bicarb is less expensive and infinitely less problematic to make a shelf-stable electrolyte. But sodium acetate has the benefit of not leaving the door open, the abomasal door open as long, because of sustained high-level pH to allow pathogens to enter and not be killed. So the product we're proposing will be fed at 4 ounces in 2 quarts. And in that, you're going to have a high level of blood buffer at 51 milliosmoles per liter. And sodium acetate will be the majority of that. There is some sodium citrate, some potassium citrate in there as well, but no sodium bicarbonate. What about increasing blood glucose? The Treff's work showed that feeding electrolyte in the survivors was definitely resulted in a higher blood level of blood glucose. And in our Mapleview Agra study that's published in JDS that we coordinated on an electrolyte similar to what we propose here, is very similar in dextrose concentration. And if we added dextrose, you can see we really raised blood glucose levels. In this comparison, we compared malto to dextrose. Maltodextrin is a glucose level, a glucose source, a sugar source that you can potentially work with sodium acetate on, but it doesn't raise blood glucose levels. So that's why we really like, we have found specialized sources of dextrose that can work with sodium acetate, and we use those, and that combined with a whole bunch of other sort of things we do in addition to that, we can kick out a product that won't kick up or lump up. So you really need to use dextrose if you can in these treatment type products so that you raise blood glucose levels. Maltodextrin is likely absorbed. This is an old study from '73 with something that sounds like it's similar in chemical structure to maltodextrin, and it did over time start raising blood glucose levels, but there isn't as much sugar there, so it really was, and it's not absorbed at as high a rate. So dextrose does raise glucose, but it also raises osmolarity. There are people out there that feel strongly that a treatment type electrolyte should have a similar osmolarity to blood or to milk, and that way it's rapidly absorbed. It doesn't await any time for the calf to pull fluids out of the bloodstream into the gut to lower the osmolarity, or it could drink more water, either one, but lower that osmolarity down to 300, because you really can't absorb the gut's contents until the digesta is the same as blood. So that is the counter. But if you do that in an electrolyte, then you don't have any way to raise blood glucose. So it's really like a fulcrum in a scale. You know, you can't have everything either way. You're either going to have a little bit higher osmolarity, but then raise blood glucose levels, or you're going to be isotonic, it would be called, and have rapid, really quick absorption, but then not raise blood glucose levels in a appreciable manner. So we like to go with this high level of dextrose. You have an osmolarity between 550 and 600 when you're feeding 4 ounces. So that's what we suggest for these treatment type electrolytes, and our research would show that you get high recovery rates. What about sodium toxicity? You know, there's an incredible need in a diarrheic calf for sodium, but if you overfed electrolytes or administered saline solution for too long, you're going to kill calves from sodium toxicity, because that's what Treff's study showed, is that many of these calves, these diarrheic calves that die, have sodium toxicity. In the Merck manual, it goes through, and you can read this, why sodium is important. It's really critical for maintaining osmotic balance and nerve and muscle function. And the calf is also losing a lot of I'll get into this, I guess, in the next slide, but this shows what hypernatremia causes. And you know, you get muscle spasms and salt poisoning and kind of water intoxication is what the result is. I always think of the former owner of Animix. He was a veal nutritionist, and he reported that when you had high sodium whey and you're feeding these calves, veal calves, you know, special milk fed veal calves, 6, even 7 pounds of powder daily at the end of their grow out, you could result in a looseness that was caused by sodium, too much sodium, and you saw scours. It resulted in that. But that Fisher et al. Is kind of the important thing, the sodium depletion rate, and you can see that a calf that is not diarrheic, it loses way less sodium compared to a diarrheic one, and it points toward this sodium depletion that's going on. And you better replace that sodium quickly with a properly formulated electrolyte, or else you're going to have a dead calf. So I'll let you read these as you want. But what we recommend, the bottom line is that we would feed these treatment type electrolytes for either 1 or 2 doses, 4-ounce doses daily, and feed that for 2 or 3 days, whatever it takes to get recovery, maybe 1 day sometimes, or 2 days, or 3 days at the most, but then stop. And we also strongly advocate to feed plain water right after the electrolyte meal, or make sure water's in front of that calf at all times so that it's getting further fluids. And keep the calves on nutrition. Some people feel strongly they need to take some nutrition away. If you're going to do that, then just take it away for the first day for maybe a half a meal, half a milk replacer meal, but then promptly get that or offer that calf as much nutrition as it will drink. We definitely don't advocate tubing milk, but we would definitely keep it in front of them because that calf desperately needs nutrition. And so you can see this electrolyte, it's really formulated with some high levels of sodium so that we're really replacing those. But the other thing, that strong ion difference, which I didn't highlight on this graph in the bottom right-hand corner, that's important for correcting blood acidemia as well. And so we have to get sodium, potassium, and chloride in the right balance so that electrolytes are retained in the calf and acidemia is corrected. So you want one with, here's the bottom line, you want a sodium acetate containing electrolyte with adequate blood buffers around 50 milliosmoles per liter, balanced for strong ion difference, so that can correct blood acidemia, meaning getting sodium, potassium, and chloride right. You want to use the correct glucose source, and you want to have it at adequate concentrations, thus the need for a 4-ounce dose and a relatively high osmolarity, so that you can raise blood glucose and correct what happens in diuretic calves that causes death. We like modestly hypertonic, maybe between 470. I would even go like what we proposed to you, up to 570 milliosmoles per liter. And enough glucose to do the job, but not excessive amounts that raise osmolarity too high. We also propose adding high levels of glycine to help with glucose and sodium uptake. We would suggest adding these bacillus for these reasons. There's one study to show that just 2 feedings of them with electrolytes improved weight gain during the scour period. It reduced Clostridium perfringens shedding significantly, reduced med costs, lactated ringers cost, and improved immune function. And that costs a whole whopping about 3 cents per dose to put in there, with some calf-specific, I'll call it, bacillus strains that have been researched pretty extensively. So we've talked a lot about this electrolyte strategy number 2 here, the scour treatment strategy, and that's for slow drinkers off milk, moderate to severe dehydration, hopefully heading off at the pass the need for as much lactated ringer use, which are really expensive and problematic for most workforces on calf ranches or dairy to administer appropriately. So that's the scour treatment type strategy, but there's also a preventative type strategy, which I'll get into next. These are very low cost. They are really a shuttle to get our flavors and sweeteners in there so that we can increase voluntary water intake and keep calves better hydrated, but they also provide a maintenance level of blood buffers and a dose, a nice little dose of dextrose to raise blood glucose levels. And I think these are really important for calves, really all calves, probably for the first 2 or 3 weeks of life as a midday bottle. And certainly during hot weather, I would feed them multiple times per day, or at least once a day, in addition to plain water, to get calves through the water loss periods that are going on from hot climates. Here's the chemical structure. I put in there 0.88 ounces, which is 25 grams in 2 quarts. As you can see, there's not a lot of blood buffer in there. We're using sodium citrate that labels well, and it'll do a little bit of correcting of blood acidemia. It's got, basically an ounce of dextrose in there. We're not correcting blood acidemia, so we don't worry about strong ion difference here. We're just getting a maintenance level of electrolytes in there. But this shows one of the large studies that we did on 8-day-old Holstein calves, long transport, commingled, probably high FPT, stressed calves. This was this veal barn that I was telling you about. And there were 128 calves, and the protocol is midday. The grower fed his calves like at 5:30 or something and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we asked him to go in at noon and offer 2 quarts of solution with this 25 grams of this type of an electrolyte in there, and then come back an hour later and visually appraise whether the calf consumed 100%, 75%, 50%, 25%, or none of the fluids presented, and record that. And then I could do some stats giving it a 1 to 5 marker. And I came up with that the calves consuming or offered the electrolyte solution consumed 30% more. 30% more. Note the 100% consumption in 77% of the calves offered the fluids with 1 ounce or 25 grams of electrolytes in there. So this will be a maintenance type electrolyte with minimal but yet some blood buffer, no sodium bicarb, a little bit of glucose, basically an ounce in there per calf daily to perk the calves up, maybe get them up hitting the grain bucket a little bit more. You could add B vitamins to this at no appreciable, really some, but very small up cost. But the big thing here is it's going to promote fluid intake. So when it's going through its routine diuretic period, the first 2 or 3 weeks of life, it's going to be hopefully much more hydrated going into that. And I'm going to get into some other features of why fluid intake is so important. It'll be inexpensive. I'll let the numbers that I send with the email, because you may want to use this with customers, this PowerPoint, but it's just a fraction of the cost of a treatment type electrolyte. So I've already talked about the number 2 strategy, how to use at 4 ounces, but I'm just pointing out the difference here. So now I'm going to get into the importance of water intake. So this supports the concept of this 25 gram and 2 quart solution type product. I love this study. This was research conducted where we do research at Mapleview Agri in Ontario. Dr. Dave Renaud is the person who does all the stats on their research and helps them set up the protocols. He's from the University of Guelph. And then João Costa's lab, some of his students analyzed a bunch of Mapleview research. And I'm going to come back to this slide, but this shows their barn. They have, note on the left, they have those 2 meters. If you follow that tube down to the calf, they present water to the calf both ways, a nipple and a drink cup. And so regardless of whichever one the calf prefers, they've got measurements of how much water is presented to that calf and consumed daily. Note the grain that they offer, and every time I've visited their facility, they have super high quality grain. They get good grain intake. Their protocol is to, by treatment group, measure back weight orts after a week, so they can get, for the group, average calf daily, weekly grain intake, and then extrapolate per day after that. So getting back to the study that they did here, on 346 calves, they monitored water and grain intake for 63 days. The calves were fed milk replacer that peaked at around 8 liters a day. They feed about, I think, 80 or 90 pounds per calf, so they're definitely on a more full growth potential type program. Water is available 24/7 via both the nipple and the bowl. And then they're weaned on day 56. They have a step up, step down strategy. So then they also monitor water and grain intake in a post-wean period where the studies end day 84 at 12 weeks. Here's the bottom line. The calves consumed on average 364 liters of water and about 150, 151 kilos, or well over 300 pounds of grain on average. But they found that every extra liter, so if they consume, say, 365 instead of 364 liters over that 12-week period, that calf on average consumed about an extra half a pound of grain. And so, extrapolate that to say like a single calf got 10 liters more. Well, that's about 5 pounds more grain intake. So you can see where I'm going with this. If we can drive water intake, we know that we can get more grain intake. The data, and this is just one set, I think the best set out there, but there's some other historic research that shows something similar to this. What was interesting in their analysis of this data, they found that each and every week of the 12 weeks, except the first week, they saw statistically significant, highly statistically significant, mostly p less than 0.001 difference or correlation between grain intake and water intake, meaning that this didn't just happen during the scour period. This didn't just happen as the rumen was being developed early in life, this correlation of more water intake equals more grain intake. This didn't just happen post-wean. It happened literally every single week in the barn, all 12 of them, except the first week they only had a trend. But even the first week with minimal grain intake, there was a trend, p less than 0.09, of correlation between increased water intake, noting increased grain intake. So it happens every single week in the barn. I think the second really compelling reason to use this maintenance type electrolyte is based on this research that Jim Quigley in a calf note annotates well. It's an old study from '81, but a dandy. They had a really intricate and scientific method to measure how much calves lose in fluids from respiring and from sweating. And they found, the bottom line, that by putting these calves in chambers, that compared to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, in other words, no heat stress, that there was a linearly increase to 6.8 liters per day compared to 1.7 per day of when you got up to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, you had well over 5 more liters of fluid losses simply from respiring and sweating. So when that calf is out in the Central Valley, even this time of year, or certainly, summer and fall, that calf is probably needing 5 more liters of water just to meet its additional respiring and sweating losses compared to the winter in California. And we all know Iowa summers can be really hot. Now I'm going to get into this palatability data in regards to the high sodium acetate containing electrolyte. Look at the difference. This was done at Mapleview Agro with an electrolyte, 4-ounce electrolyte per 2-quart product, similar to the one I'm proposing to you, but with the same identical levels of palatants and sweeteners. And look at the dramatic difference in voluntary intake of 100%. The calves that were sick consumed 90% of the fluids of this electrolyte if it had the sweetener compared to plain water. And this would include, of course, a high level of dextrose in there too. So it's not just the flavor and sweetener. It's also, I'm sure, the extra dextrose in there. But calves like sweet, calves like our flavors, calves like the combination. 90% consumption versus 49% consumption if you just offered plain water. So this diuretic calf that's losing a lot of fluids is really benefiting from having that electrolyte in there, just in getting more fluid into itself. Now I talked about sodium bicarb in these type electrolytes versus sodium acetate. Sodium acetates have great benefit, but this is the drawback. If you don't know what you're doing, it can come out of our blender looking like that. We've seen in 4 hours with the wrong sugar sources, the wrong manufacturing procedures, and the wrong other components in there. In other words, not knowing what you're doing, you can start getting that browning right away, just within hours. But even if you've got kind of things mostly right, but then you throw it into a really hot desert climate or a really hot summer muggy day in the Midwest, over time you're going to create what's on the left. And at worst, in only one instance that I'm aware of at least, we created what's on the right. So these hot boxes studies that Emily and others at Animix have done, we've totally gotten rid of what's on the left and on the right. So you buy a product that looks like the powder in the middle, and you can look at it a year later, it's going to look like the product in the middle. So in conclusion, we have a two-pronged strategy, an inexpensive preventative strategy with an idea of driving fluid intake, because we know driving fluid intake both drives performance because of increased grain intake and then associated rumen health improvements and weaning probably strategy improvements, but then also because in heat stress, that calf really has a dramatic increase in fluid needs to replace lost bodily fluids that are lost from respiring and from sweating. So in the first strategy, we need to drive fluid intake to replace fluids lost from diarrhea, to correct blood acidemia, to raise blood glucose, and with enough sodium to replace the stores that have been lost due to the calf being in a diarrheic situation. But in the second one, we're going to get rid of all those things that can cause sodium toxicity. We're not going to feed a big high dose. We're going to feed just less than 1 ounce or 1 ounce. It's going to have a little bit of glucose, a little bit of blood buffer, but it's going to be a shuttle to get the flavors and sweeteners in there and also the dextrose to drive fluid intake. And so we can hopefully head off more diarrhea at the pass before it gets started and put the calf in a positive fluid situation. So that's it.